Welcome, dear readers. You're listening to Time to Read, a Winnipeg Public Library podcast book club. We're recording today from various locations around Winnipeg, which is within Treaty 1 territory, the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, Ininew, and Dakota peoples, and in the National Homeland of the Red River Métis. Our drinking water comes from Shoal Lake 4D First Nation in Treaty 3 territory. In this episode, we will be discussing Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen. I'm Dennis from the Idea Mill, and I hope I do not flatter myself unduly that you might not be disinclined to hear the speaker use many double negatives. Across the screen from me is...
I'm Toby, I'm an outreach librarian, and it is a truth universally acknowledged that Colin Firth looks better when wet. And across the screen from me is...
Hi, I'm Trevor from the Louisville Library, and honestly, I thought there would be more zombies.
A good book can carry me away from an average and ordinary day, yeah. So keep it down, leave me alone, close the doors and turn off the phone, 'cause all I ever really need is a little more time to read.
And you, dear readers, we wouldn't do this without you. We'd love to know what you think about the books we're reading. Could you send your footman to our estate with a missive explaining your opinions at length? If not, how about an email? You can find our email address and all our social media outlets by going to wpl-podcast.winnipeg.ca and scrolling to the bottom of the page. Hang around till the end of the episode to enjoy our most august segment, Nerd Words for Word Nerds. Before we proceed further, let's check in with the panel. How you guys doing?
Okay, we are still recording remotely because I am still recovering from my knee surgery, so there's that.
You are almost in nature today.
Almost, yes. I'm in my sunroom, and I have lovely sun coming down on me from all sides, though it is a little chilly in here.
Mm-hmm. Did we have any news and stuff to share?
Well, just from the world of literature, a special shout out to Han Kang, who is this year's Nobel laureate for literature from the Nobel Prize. She is a writer from South Korea. Apparently the first Asian writer ever to win a Nobel Prize in literature. So seems surprising, but then the Swedish Academy works in mysterious ways. Her books are just now being translated into English. So if you haven't heard of her or haven't read her, that is okay, because unless you are fluent in Korean, you probably haven't read her. But a friend of mine who grew up in Korea in the 1980s says that her novel called Human Acts is really the one you want to start with, because it features this Gwangju uprising from 1980 that turned into a massacre. It was a huge political thing, and he grew up during that time. Definitely get your holds placed for her books. In the meantime, I suggest reading this great graphic novel called Banned Book Club by Kim Hyun-suk. It's a YA graphic novel, but it also deals with students in Korea in the early 1980s. I just out of coincidence, I was reading it when the Nobel Prize winner was announced. So there you go. I always finger on the pulse. That's me.
And tossing in an extra book recommendation, too.
Right. Got to pad the show notes.
Have you read anything by Han Kang?
I have not. Have you?
I have. I read a book called The Vegetarian. This was many years ago, and it's a very, very strange. I recall it being kind of like body horror. But so not really my thing, but maybe your thing.
Yeah, bring it on.
Yeah.
I like horror. Body horror isn't my thing. Did we have anything else we wanted to check in on?
All good.
Okay. Well, in that case, Toby is going to tell us about the author, after which Trevor will give us a summary of the book.
So I just want to preface this by saying that Jane Austen was 41 when she died, which is very young to have had such a huge impact on English literature. So I just think that's a thing to keep in mind throughout this. So she was born December 16th, 1775. All of her biographical information comes from letters as well as sketches her family wrote about her. She is thought to have written about 3,000 letters in her life, though only about 160 survived. Her sister Cassandra destroyed most of the letters she received. The two were very close, and Cassandra was a bit of a jealous guardian of Jane, as she wanted to ensure that the younger nieces did not read any of Jane's sometimes acid or forthright comments on neighbors or family members. Austen was born to George Austen, who was a rector, and Cassandra Lee. She was the seventh of 8 children. Her family was not wealthy. I think this is important to note. Do you know what I mean when I say gentry? No, sort of.
Like, I think landed gentry is just people who owned a lot of land, right? So they were very wealthy, but not...
Yeah,
and the urban gentry is a YouTube channel by a watch enthusiast.
Okay, different thing. When I say gentry in this situation, I'm talking about sort of people of good social position. So specifically in the UK, it's the class of people right below the nobility. Austen's family were very kind of lesser gentry. They lived like the gentry. They often married into it, but they did depend on a male family member with a job to maintain their lifestyle. So the family wasn't wealthy. Austen did have some schooling outside of the home, but they couldn't really afford it, so she was mostly educated at home. And she wrote from an early age. She wrote stories and plays for her family's entertainment. She did never marry, though she had an interest. In 1795, at the age of 20, she met someone named Thomas Lefroy, and I really love this, so I just had to add it. But in a letter to Cassandra about Thomas Lefroy, she wrote, "I am almost afraid to tell you how my Irish friend and I behaved. Imagine to yourself everything most profligate and shocking in the way of dancing and sitting down together."
Whoa.
Yeah, pretty saucy stuff. Neither Lefroy or Austen had money, and so this relationship didn't work out. Between 1795 and 1799, Austen completed drafts of the novels Sense and Sensibility, Pride and Prejudice, and Northanger Abbey, though it wasn't considered proper for women of the gentry to write for money, so she struggled to get them published. Sense and Sensibility was eventually published anonymously in 1811 and was described as being written by a lady. The reviews were favorable, the novel became fashionable, Pride and Prejudice followed in 1813, and this book and all future works were billed as written by the author of Sense and Sensibility, and her name never appeared on her books during her lifetime. Mansfield Park was published in 1814 and Emma in 1816. In 1816, she started feeling unwell, which scholars now believe was either due to Addison's disease or Hodgkin's lymphoma. She stopped writing by early 1817 and died July 18th, 1817 at the age of 41. And after her death, Persuasion and Northanger Abbey were published, and in a biographical note by her brother, she was for the first time identified as the author of the novels. There's
That's
Jane Austen
wild.
in a nutshell.
Yeah, I don't think I ever knew really anything about her.
Well, now you do.
I do. Well, if you guys want to hear a summary of Pride and Prejudice, I cobbled this together from various sources. In Pride and Prejudice, the spirited Elizabeth Bennet navigates the complexities of society and love in early 19th century England. With her keen wit and independent spirit, she grapples with the expectations placed upon her as one of 5 daughters. The arrival of the enigmatic Mr. Darcy ignites in Elizabeth both disdain and intrigue. His prideful demeanor belies a depth of character that Elizabeth gradually comes to appreciate. Misunderstandings and societal pressures abound, yet, through a series of revelations, both characters undergo transformations. Ultimately, their journey towards mutual respect and love illuminates the folly of pride and the redemptive power of understanding.
Succinct.
Thanks very much. I didn't want to put too many spoilers in because I know, people are still just rediscovering this book. So, I thought.
Yeah, I think, 200 some years is a little too soon for spoilers. Okay,
so how'd you guys find the book?
Oh, you stole Dennis's line.
Dennis was sort of.
I'm shocked.
Dennis failed to introduce me as the summary reader, so I thought maybe he's just not 100% on his game today. So I thought I'd better jump in there.
I don't normally introduce you.
Really?
I was about to because normally you just pick it up. But
I was waiting for the call. It didn't happen. Like, boy. Is there enough air getting into that sound booth?
No.
Anyway, enough of these gentle barbs.
Well, I guess since I don't normally go first on this, I may as well. I have never read any Jane Austen previously. I have never watched any movies based on Jane Austen's works or any series or any comic adaptations or anything like that. So this was brand new to me. I started by getting the Project Gutenberg ebook version of it, which has like a 20-page intro from a literary scholar that I started to read, but just kind of went on and on. And was just extremely effusive. So I was like, okay, skip that, get to the book. I found it a little slow going to start, and then I thought, you know what, this calls for an audiobook. So I got the audiobook version from Libby, And I have to say, the first, I'll say third of the novel, I found very slow and tedious. I was starting to worry that I was going to have to like trash this much loved book in the podcast, which I hate to do. But then as the book continued, I found that it started getting more interesting. And even though it's one of these things where it's kind of obvious what's going to happen, I mean, I don't know much about the book, but I do know that they get together, right? It's a romance. And it draws out so slowly that I found towards the end, I was actually like, come on, guys, come on. You're right there. Go. You know, I was feeling emotions, and I was satisfied by the ending. And that was a little surprise to me based on how it started. I kind of feel like Elizabeth and Mr. Darcy felt at the beginning, not really liking it, but, you know, towards the end, actually enjoying the book and enjoying the characters, even though I didn't like so many of the characters. So yeah, that was my feeling reading the book.
Maybe I'll go next because I feel like I'm on a similar familiarity with Jane Austen as Dennis, and I'm making assumptions here, but I'm assuming that perhaps Toby has had more experience reading Jane Austen than myself. I also have never read anything by her, although I have seen the mid-90s BBC miniseries of Pride and Prejudice that famously starred Colin Firth in a wet T-shirt at one point, which I kept waiting for that scene. I'm sorry?
It's more of a blouse, isn't it?
A blouse. You're right. No, they didn't have T-shirts back in 1800s. It was like almost like a pirate shirt, a shirt you might see a pirate wear. And he emerges from the pond at Pemberley when Elizabeth is visiting. And it's a very sexually charged scene. And the whole time reading the book, I'm like, I can't wait till I get to that part where Darcy comes out of the pond. He never does. Never comes out of the pond. I guess that was an embellishment by the producers, because they're like, you know what, this is a classic story, beloved by many, but what it doesn't have is Darcy's nipples. And so they added that, and you know what? It was a good choice.
100%.
Yeah, so, you know, I sort of read this novel, and I was, from the very first line, which Toby paraphrased at the beginning, I was like, I've heard this line before. So the story felt familiar, obviously, because I knew some of the characters' names. It's been a while since I've seen the miniseries, so I had that sort of the broad structure of what was going on, but I felt like it was like there were these little sort of call-outs or callbacks to things that I have heard over the years, but then realizing that, no, these are actually the original time these lines have been used, and yet they've been kind of absorbed into our pop culture. So I enjoyed it. I did find the writing a bit difficult sometimes. I found myself rereading sentences or passages because I didn't feel like I fully understood. I'm still not sure I fully understand the entailment process of property. But yeah, by the time I got to the end of it, I was like, oh, wow, I feel like I've really accomplished something by reading Jane Austen. And I enjoyed it.
Oh, it's nice to hear that you both enjoyed this book for the most part. I have read almost all of Jane Austen's books. What's nice about her having died early is that you can be a completist of hers quite easily because she doesn't have a ton of work. But I do really like this book. It's definitely of its time, you know, the style of writing, the language, the situation. But it's really like just a classic enemies to lovers romance when you think about it. You know, it does ramble as novels of this time do. You know, we get a lot of information about people's estates and their grounds, and people take forever to get to their point. But it's very funny, you know, like it's very dry, like so dry that you can almost miss the humor if you're not reading closely. And Austen just, I mean, she's a great writer, and she's such a good observer of people, and she has so much insight into her characters. It's really, I like this book a lot.
What sort of struck me, too, was how relatable so many of these characters were, even though it's been over 200 years, that just some of like the personality traits of many of these characters you still see in people today, you know, and I'm not going to name any names, but I definitely know people personally and in the world that I could say, oh, that person's a total Mr. Collins, for example, or whatever. Like, and so these scenes were played for almost like extreme effect, but they're subtle at the same time because, if you read it quickly, you wouldn't maybe get all the humor. Like that part with Collins, again, talking about how delicious these boiled potatoes are, which is ridiculous because boiled potatoes don't taste like anything, But that's a great, just one little thing. And I'm going to go on a rant about Collins. Just every time he opened his mouth about that...
Lady Catherine.
Lady Catherine. Oh, my God.
Lady Catherine has condescended to speak to us.
Yeah. Oh, my God. And yet, it's weird. Like, the marriage, spoilers, Collins ends up proposing to Elizabeth, and she turns him down. So then he proposes and marries Elizabeth's friend, Charlotte. Like, their marriage was, I don't know, like, not full of fireworks. But it was okay.
Yeah, I mean, that's what's sad about these books, I think, is, I think a lot of, or I personally, I read them in my early 20s and I find them very romantic. And then when I reread them later on, it's like, oh, these women have no choice, like they need to get married, or they're going to be destitute. And I think Charlotte, I guess, is the example of that here. I mean, all the Bennet sisters kind of marry for love, which is pretty amazing. But yeah, poor Charlotte Lucas.
Further to the point about how important marriage is, Lydia marries Wickham for love, but they're not doing well.
Oh, yeah, that relationship they're going to be miserable, those two.
Yeah, so it's like, and it kind of emphasized why Mrs. Bennet was all big on, no, gotta marry well. Otherwise, you're stuck and you got no way to make more money yourself. You're relying on your husband. And there's Lydia, went off rashly and constantly begging relatives for cash. Hey, can you spare a couple $100? Can you, give us some money? We're kind of stuck.
One of the most relatable characters for me was Mr. Bennet. I like the idea that he'd just sit in his library and read his books. And even though, like, the future of his family was kind of at stake, like, when he passes away, there's a very real chance that his daughters and wife are going to be left with nothing. It didn't seem to bother him. Like
I guess that's not his problem.
Yeah. No, I guess not. He was almost just like an observer, like, oh, I have these silly daughters, and my wife, she's hysterical, and he did sort of have special, it seemed like, connections with each of his daughters, especially we see the connections between him and Elizabeth, but I imagine that he probably had similar kind of one-on-ones, whatever, with his other daughters. Maybe not Lydia so much, but yeah, I always thought whenever he opened his mouth, I laughed. Like, one of my favorite lines from him when he's talking to his wife is, "I don't have the pleasure of understanding you." And I'll tell you what, I've been using that one around the home, and it doesn't get the same kind of reaction as I thought it might. Yeah,
Mr. Bennet is so indifferent to the plight of his daughters, yet him and Elizabeth are very close, and he wants what's best for her. He wants what she wants. And so, I guess he's a good contrast to Mrs. Bennet, who's too involved and too overbearing and is in such a tizzy to get all of her daughters married and married well.
Yeah, like you say, maybe they're a good balance for each other.
Yeah.
Oh, I don't know about that, though. Like, the way they describe it is basically that, they got married, and then at some point, Mr. Bennet realizes he doesn't really like his wife. She won't shut up. She's worked up about all kinds of stuff. She's focused on very different things than he is. And he tunes out. He's in the library reading and keeping to himself because he doesn't want to spend a lot of time with her, and he doesn't want to deal with all of her drama. And towards the end there, when Mr. Bennet is talking to Elizabeth about marrying Darcy, that's his main thing. It's like, I don't want you to get in a marriage where you don't like your partner, because it's not good, So, like, the whole story, it's basically Mr. Bennet being unhappy, but, like, trying his best to weed out whatever happiness he can by just avoiding everybody else. It's kind of like a cautionary example. The same way Collins and Charlotte is kind of another cautionary example. This could be your life.
Yeah.
And, of course, when Lydia runs off at one point, I forget who says it. Maybe it was Elizabeth, but basically, like, they laid it at Mr. Bennet's feet because he wasn't being enough of a father to give her guidance. And then she went off and did something detrimental to her future happiness.
Oh, Lydia, that slut. I mean,
Mr. Bennett was blamed because he wouldn't relocate the whole family down to Brighton. Remember, he's like, we're not going there.
Right, for the soldiers.
For the soldiers, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the whole thing with Lydia, like, Lydia's just Lydia, and she's flighty, and she is boy crazy, and I think it's unfair to blame her family for her failings. And I do think that whole bit where she runs away and it's a scandal because they're not yet married and she's going to bring shame on the whole family, I find that very interesting.
You know, because the book's over 200 years old, culture is very different, and I didn't have enough context for that scene, or for that section where she ran off. So, like, everyone was so worked up, and we had already heard that Wickham had made some sort of play for Mr. Darcy's sister, but it was kept very vague. And so I'm going to darker places thinking, like, did he try to rape the young Miss Darcy? Is that what they're worried about? That he's basically taken her and he's going to have his way with her? And it turns out, no, it's just that they're not married and they might do married things without being married.
And Wickham has no money, so it's curious that he would even go for Lydia, because he went for Darcy's sister in the hopes of, you know, her fortune. But Lydia doesn't have any money. I mean, maybe she has more money than he does. Yeah, maybe, but, you know, if she's, you know, throwing herself at him, maybe it appeals to his ego or something, too.
Well, I think they answered that in the book. Either the narrator or one of the characters said that, like, Wickham was in a bad spot and had to leave because of all of his debts. And Lydia wanted to go with him. And, well, she was an agreeable traveling companion, so he went with that. But then when they found her in London, or found Wickham in London, it sounded like Wickham was not interested in marrying her at all.
Yeah,
but was
Darcy
basically
kind of forced them.
Yeah, he bribed him into it, you know. I'll get you a commission. You'll do this. There's some money. I'll pay off your debts. You know, and then from Wickham's point of view, it's like, I guess, like, you know, better than the alternative. So that's the other thing. And towards the end of the book, it sounded like their affections were not as strong as they had been, that Wickham was not as interested in Lydia anymore. And so Lydia was kind of stuck too in a similar kind of loveless relationship to her dad's.
Yeah, it's sad.
It is very sad. I found that part a little heartbreaking, you know.
And she has to move so far away from her family, you know, at least like Charlotte Lucas, you know, she's practical. She knows, like, when Collins proposes to her, it's like, well, it's close to home. He's an idiot, but, like, you know, I can run the household and I don't have to be with him that much. And, you know, she's practical. She makes a decision. And in the end, it's not a great situation, but it's better than Lydia's.
Totally.
I like how when they were talking, like when Elizabeth had gone over, the point was made that Mr. Collins spent a lot of time in the garden, like making everything nice, and that his wife heartily encouraged it so that, like, she gets the house to herself while he's out buttering in the garden. It's like, yep, a very practical woman.
Yeah. I got a little stuck on in this book was that there's the whole thing with Darcy and Bingley and Jane, and Darcy doesn't want Bingley to marry Jane because he thinks basically the Bennet family are trash, yet he still wants to be with Elizabeth, and Elizabeth doesn't seem to have any issue with him thinking so poorly of her family.
Well, that's a love conquering all, you know, and...
But it's like, I don't want my friend to marry into your family, but I'll marry into your family?
Yeah, but isn't that sort of, like, relatable in the sense that, like, so often people have opinions about other people, but they're hypocrites because they don't apply that same standard to themselves. So if he's seen as, because, like, Darcy, you know, for all the hero sides he's given, he was pretty manipulative by saying, Bingley, because Bingley, you know, he seems like a nice, but kind of a doofus, you know, like just kind of a nice guy, but very kind of impressionable. So if Darcy says to him, you know what, you know, Jane, she's not into you, and look at her family, you know, you can do better. He's like, oh, she's not into me? Oh, okay. But then, you know, of course, Darcy later on is like, yeah, I remember what I said all that about Jane. Yeah, I guess I was wrong, or whatever. I mean, he doesn't say that, but that's kind of the subtext. because, of course, he's got the hots for Lizzie.
Well, there's also the fact that at the time that Darcy shooed Bingley away from her, that was still early on, and he wasn't that into Elizabeth at that point. Like, he was recognizing, oh, actually, she's kind of interesting, but I can't be with her. He was still at that phase where she was interesting him, but he was not in love at that point and was not really... so I don't think it was contradictory for him at that point to warn Bingley off. And
but
then later on,
his opinion of their family didn't really change.
No, like even in that letter he wrote, remember the letter was still really like, your family, is terrible.
Yeah.
But the letter kind of sort of half redeems himself because he talks about his role in the relationship with the Wickham, but he's still full on doesn't change his position on the family, saying this is why I did that because your family is garbage. I mean,
I guess he thinks highly of Elizabeth and Jane, but the rest of them, yeah.
But at the same time, though, Elizabeth, after reading the letter and after having calmed down and reconsidered it, is like, yeah, he's kind of right about my family. It's like, yeah, when I think of my mom and I think of Lydia and how indifferent Dad is, it's like, yeah, okay, I get it. So at that point, she's kind of like, yeah, he had a point. So even Elizabeth is recognizing that her family ain't that great to marry into. But then by the time Darcy's falling in love and he's like, well, maybe they're not so bad. Like, okay, I thought Jane was a little cool, but, I'm looking at her now and, oh, yeah, okay, I see it now. I see it, and it's, well, Mr. Bennet's not so bad, and well, Lydia is at least moved far away.
And Mary's okay. Mary's not boy crazy.
No, Mary's just reading books all the time and being very judgmental whenever she talks about stuff.
Yeah.
Trevor had shared with us a Reddit post that he had found where a reader had come up with an alternate version of the story so he could insert himself as a character. And one of his things was having Collins marry Mary, because they're both kind of judgmental and would probably do quite well together.
Yeah, I had seen that post before you sent it to us, Trevor. But there's also that was the books subreddit, right? Because there's also a Jane Austen subreddit, and there's also a Pride and Prejudice subreddit. But the Pride and Prejudice subreddit is mostly people posting about which actors they see in the various roles of this book. So
I thought it was kind of funny that this guy on Reddit, he described himself as a burly, hairy Australian man. But he loves this book and he reads it every couple of years. And at the point when Collins is just about to marry Charlotte, he appears as a character in his own version of the book and marries Charlotte himself.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
saving her from a bitter end.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
how chivalrous.
I mean, that's weird, right?
What do
you guys
fanfic?
Yeah, do you guys insert yourselves into books like, okay, having said that, I realized I didn't do this with a book, but I remember when I watched the Wes Anderson movie, The Life Aquatic with Steve Zissou, I kept thinking that I would like to be a part of Team Zissou, and I would be like the ship's librarian.
Ooh, I like that.
Yeah.
You'd look good in that uniform, too.
the baby blue and the...
Yeah. You'd have to grow your beard back, though.
Yes, I would. Yeah. I would do it. I would do it for Team Zissou.
So I was thinking we'd talked already about a lot of the characters, but we haven't really talked much about Elizabeth and Darcy. Mm-hmm. So what do you think of Elizabeth and Darcy?
He had pride, she had prejudice. They were a match made in heaven.
Or did they both have both pride and prejudice?
Or was the pride and prejudice inside us all along?
Ooh.
They were the friends we met along the way.
I watched I think it's like the 2005 Keira Knightley movie version, because I hadn't seen it. And Darcy is played by Matthew Macfadyen. Do you know Matthew Macfadyen? He's, I think he is now known to North American audiences as Tom in Succession. Okay.
I haven't watched that
either. You don't know that. Okay, well, he's a British actor, but he's now playing in a popular American TV show. But he looks, in this movie... He looks like his dog has died for the first, 2/3. He looks so miserable. He has this, very sad expression on his face, which maybe is supposed to be haughty, but just looks extremely sad. And that's kind of now how I'm picturing Darcy in the book, just like very miserable and I guess prideful is the term.
I kind of felt reading the book that maybe Darcy just wasn't very good at talking. Like, he was kind of shy. Mm-hmm. That seemed to be part of his thing. He was a little more introverted, a little more withdrawn, but he's in like a public position. And I know from personal experience, if you're an introvert and you don't talk a lot in certain situations, sometimes people think you're a jerk. I had a coworker once tell me after we'd worked together many years that when we first started working together, she thought I was a jerk. And then when she got to know me more as we worked together more, realized, oh, I'm an okay guy. But it was basically because we didn't talk a lot. And some people find that to be rude. So I kind of felt reading through that part of Darcy's thing was that just he's a quiet guy.
Yeah, and there's that saying, like, still waters run deep, or actions are more important than words. And so, the stuff that Darcy was doing, his appearance and his personality didn't really give a sense of what his character was. And Elizabeth found that out maybe throughout, bit by bit. And then maybe his character did change. He kind of warmed up a bit. I don't know.
Oh, he definitely warmed up a bit. I mean, after that letter, he's like, oh, am I being a jerk? Maybe I'm being a jerk. Maybe I gotta, tone it down. And started trying to be friendlier to people, which worked its magic. I mean, Elizabeth was like, oh my goodness, what the heck is going on here?
Yeah, and he really flew into action when Lydia disappeared. Like, he went right to London.
Yeah. Even though they keep that hidden in the book, you're reading it, and it's like, yeah, it's kind of obvious Darcy's doing something here. And later on, they're like, oh, how did my uncle afford this great expense? And, Mr. Bennett is like, how am I going to pay him back for all this? And I'm like, yeah, I'm not thinking he did that.
Right.
I'm thinking his Darcy was at play here.
His brother-in-law is all like, don't ask me about it. Don't ask me. Consider it taken care of or whatever. It's all very, very weird.
Yeah, one of the things I like about this book is that the character arcs are very defined. Most of the characters change considerably from the beginning to the end, and mostly Darcy and Elizabeth. And so it makes sense that they end up together. They do start out as enemies because they misunderstand each other, and they learn to change their ways throughout the book and end up together at the end.
I think Darcy was also working against having Wickham slander him all the time.
Yes.
Which a lot of the book, it reminded me of like a high school teen drama, which probably is because a lot of high school teen dramas are based on Pride and Prejudice and books like it. It's very, very gossipy. Everyone's like, oh, did you hear the latest news? Oh, this person gets this much a year. Oh, this person did such and such. What a scandal,
Well, they have nothing else to do. They don't work.
Yeah. I know, that's the thing. You're reading the whole thing and it's like no one's got a job except for the soldiers, right? No one has got a job.
And there's a line, and I'm going to be paraphrasing it, but one of the characters, I may have been Mr. Bennett, says, our neighbors are there to entertain us, or something. Like, the idea that their only existence is we have to watch them because there's crazy things going on and we're providing entertainment to them, kind of thing.
Yeah, and I mean, there's so many things that they do to occupy themselves. There's the balls, and there's their card games, and there's the visiting neighbors. I mean, what else are you going to do?
And if you're going over for a visit, that means you're going to be there like a week or a month or something.
Yeah, especially if you get sick and you can't travel home. You just have to stay until you get better. It's so weird, isn't it? Can you imagine if I came over to one of your houses and I got sick and I was just like, okay, well, I guess I'm staying here now.
You will stay in one of our 20 bedrooms and our servants will come feed you and stuff. And, No, I can't imagine that. If you come over to my place and you're too sick to go home, you're sleeping on the floor in the living room.
I mean, I guess the distances are shorter. We're not talking about needing to hop in a carriage and travel 30 miles, but still, it's so weird that she would just stay there.
It wasn't even that far. It was
no,
miles.
Jane or Elizabeth walked.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're right. It wasn't far.
Well, I mean, from Jane's point of view, she wanted to be there, so it was kind of convenient to be sick,
Yes,
yeah, and the mom loved that she was there. She wished she never got better.
I'm too sick to travel. I guess I better stay here. Oh, darn it. Hey, Mr. Bingley. I'm feeling down, but not too down to talk to you. And, of course, we get the most exposure to Elizabeth, since she's the main focus of the book. she's bright, intelligent, wrong about some things, but, a very positive person for the most part.
Yeah, and she speaks her mind, and she's not willing to settle, which, I think a lot of people are or have to be at this time.
I thought her turning down Mr. Collins' proposal was just... This is where at the point where I was still really annoyed by the book, but he's like, oh no, I don't want to marry you. It's like, oh, I understand that young ladies are sometimes reluctant on the first proposal, but have no fear, I will return and propose again, and basically saying, I'm just going to keep coming back. And she has no, you don't understand. It's never happening. We could be the last people on earth. It is not happening. And he's like, oh, yes, I understand. This is common among the young ladies. It's like, no, I will run out of the woods and get eaten by a bear. Go away.
Mr. Collins.
Oh, the most odious character in the book in some ways.
Yeah, very, sniveling.
Oh.
Also,
going on and on. Yeah, Lady Catherine this, Lady Catherine that. Look at what she's done for us. Look how great she is,
I have known many pastors over the years, even including my brother and his wife, who were both pastors in a church, and I do not know a single one where you could have the number of conversations they had with Mr. Collins and never mention a Bible verse or talk about theology in any way.
Well, what's strange is it was like he was just appointed to the clergy. He didn't study to be a clergyman. This wasn't like his grand plan in life. It was just like, okay, you're now a clergy. You're in charge of this parish, and
wasn't that was what Wickham was originally set up to be as well.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
It's crazy.
Well, he clearly viewed it as a job. I don't know if it said he didn't study for it. I think he probably did, because Wickham was expected to study for the clergy as well, and he didn't. I felt like Collins had done the study, but the thing is, it's not that he cared about the church or religion or God or anything like that. It's just, oh, okay, now I got my parsonage. I have a place to stay. I'm near a good, wealthy neighbor. And then that was it for him. It was he was judgmental about Lydia and other situations. He had no problem saying, oh, this is bad and I will not support it. But also, I just found it weird that he never really talked religion at all casually, because, again, when I talk to pastors and other people who are in the church a lot, it's hard not to hear it. It comes out naturally in conversation, and it just didn't with him. And that kind of, either it means that the author wasn't observing that type of character properly, which seems unlikely. Like you said, Austen's dad was a rector, right? So she would have been familiar with that. Or it's just that, Collins did not care about that aspect that much. It wasn't really important to him, and it was much more about the position he had in society.
And to be fair, we never really did see Mr. Collins in his official capacity as a rector, right? He was always it was like as a family member or as a cousin, he was always off the clocks. But I take your point that even when you're not delivering a sermon or performing pastoral care, you tend to. It's just part of your person. You can't imagine it would never come out otherwise. But we kind of saw him when he was letting his hair down.
Yes, quite.
And he has other concerns. I told you what
Lady Catherine said to me.
Yeah.
That was a good example of how obsequious some people can be for the benefit of being just in the shadow of a consequential person, as they often described it. The social structure thing really felt very heavy too. Like how certain people's opinions and attention were much, much, much more important than other people's.
Yeah, class was kind of everything in these days, right? You socialized within your class, you married within your class, or higher, you're always aiming to get higher, I guess.
Yeah, Jane Austen didn't really touch upon sort of the servant class in this book. I don't know if she does in any of other novels. Wasn't sort of like a Downton Abbey situation where you get to hear the maids, gossiping about the families or the cook. Yeah, there were maids that would come in and out of the room and stuff, but that wasn't her focus.
I'm not sure, because now that I've watched the movie, I'm unsure if I'm remembering things from the movie that are not in the book or vice versa. But wasn't there a moment where Mr. Collins at the Bennetts for dinner and he comments on how the daughters are good cooks, and Mrs. Bennett is like, no, like we have a cook who it's not my, yeah.
No, yeah, that definitely happens, because she wants to make sure he understands, no, we may not be well off, but we're well enough to have a cook.
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
Yeah. No, this is, when we read Remains of the Day, that was very different, because that was showing a lot from the servants' perspective. I wonder if you would expect the attitudes of the servants at this time to be the same as expressed in Remains of the Day, about the importance of duty and serving your master and how important they are and what great people they are, that kind of thing.
That's what I liked about watching the movie, because it really, even though all of the families in this book are the gentry, the movie really shows, well, the Bennetts are the lesser gentry, and their house looks poor and their servants are shabbier. And then we go over to Pemberley, and Darcy's estate is so much lovelier, and his servants are so much, they're better dressed. And so you really get clearer understanding of where people are in this hierarchy. I would recommend it. I was pleasantly surprised. I wanted to watch the BBC one as well, but it's a lot longer.
Oh, yeah. I have been meaning now, since listening to it, to actually watch one of the adaptations.
Yeah, I recommend the movie. The characters, it's cast very well, and you can just tell by looking at a person what they're like. Caroline Bingley, for instance, she's very, haughty, and her head is always held very high, and she just looks extremely snobby. And Mr. Collins is cast really well. He's very short, and he's just, he has this really weird haircut. It's, it's very good.
Does the movie pay homage to the pond scene?
It does not. No.
Okay.
No. There is a wonderful moment though where Darcy is walking towards Elizabeth, and he's coming out of the fog, and it's 2 minutes long of just him striding across the fields in a nice blouse and tight pants, and it's a good one.
Yeah, the audiobook version I listened to, the narrator did a lot of voices. When you're listening to the audiobook, you're relying a lot on the narrator for characterization, but did a really good job with the voices. So, Lydia was very, I'm doing this thing, and it was so delightful, and we were laughing all day, and I just hated that voice. But it really expressed the, super chatty, excitable teen who was very gossipy and very interested in the affections of the men. And Mr. Collins in particular, the narrator, was the very good, even though the character I think was supposed to be 25 years old, the voice sounded like it was a much older man. It's just very pompous and, wish to speak in a certain way to indicate my method of living. So I kind of want to see how they're cast, see them played out. It'll be interesting.
Well, it's on Netflix.
Is there more stuff we want to cover?
I mean, I feel like we could talk about this book for a long time. I mean, I'm curious about the lasting impact of this book. Why, even today it's so popular. That's something I've been thinking on.
Yeah, and something that was a surprise to me too was just I knew this book was popular. It's one of the foundational novels, but I wasn't as aware of the Austen verse, if you will, where there's been literally dozens of novels, spin-offs, reimaginings of these characters. And it's amazing. There's literally, we're talking a little bit about fan fiction, but this is an established genre of, stories taking place in the Jane Austen universe, and I guess that happens from time to time. There's stories that take place in the Sherlock Holmes universe. That's another fictional character. But I don't know, just it is surprising or just interesting that captures the imagination of our culture in the last 200 years, that the story keeps finding its audience and inspires people.
I'm not normally a romance reader and wasn't expecting to be as affected towards the end, actually cheering them on and wanting that to happen, to get together, finally, come on, you guys. So whatever it is, it evokes an emotional reaction where you might not expect one, given how slow it goes and how old the language is and how different the customs are. At the end, it's still yeah, these two should get together. You become invested in them. I was pleasantly surprised. Would you recommend the book to people?
Oh, absolutely. I think it's a classic for a reason. It's kind of, I think, fashionable to have read these books and to love them. But there's just something very charming and endearing about them. And it's lovely.
Yeah, I found it just very relevant, accessible. Can't say that for too many books that are over 200 years old, I don't think. Enjoyable, funny, unexpectedly funny, and everyone likes a happy ending.
Okay, well, it sounds like a 3 out of 3. We all recommend this book. Go out and read it if you haven't. Okay, so then that takes us to our next segment. Can you tell me a book I would also like?
I'm going to let you go, Trevor, because I stole your book last time. So
that is very generous of you. Well, my book follows in what I had just previously referred to as the Austen verse. So if you are wondering what happened to the characters of Pride and Prejudice, I recommend Death Comes to Pemberley by P.D. James. Now, P.D. James is a powerhouse English writer in her own right, mostly mysteries, but she dabbled in science fiction, and she's since passed away. But before she did, she wrote a mystery called Death Comes to Pemberley, which is set 6 years after the events of Pride and Prejudice. And surprisingly, George Wickham is still married to Lydia. But
surprisingly, what choice do they have?
Well, I guess you're right. But yeah, let me rephrase that. Maybe not surprisingly they're still married, but they're still together? I don't know. But anyway, wouldn't you know, George Wickham is charged with murder. And so, I mean, that's basically the idea. On the grounds of Pemberley, no less. And so the rest of the novel is set up kind of like a police procedural. There's a trial. And it might be a little bit like the last episode of Seinfeld, because then different characters from Pride and Prejudice are called to the stand to either as a character witnesses or to give evidence. And it's fun. It's P.D. James actually writes it as a pastiche of Jane Austen, so she uses a lot of the similar language that Jane Austen would have used. It's fun, and if you don't want to read it, it was made into a miniseries that I'm sure I haven't seen, but is probably also enjoyable. So that's Death Comes to Pemberley by P.D. James.
That's a great recommendation. I am curious.
Yeah, me too, and I don't really read mysteries.
Whoa.
Yeah. So my book is also kind of in the Pride and Prejudice universe. It's Bridget Jones's Diary by Helen Fielding. So this is an old book. It's from 1996, and it's about Bridget Jones, who's a neurotic 30-something Londoner who strives for self-improvement. And the book is her diary entries, as the title suggests, where she writes about her goals, where she wants to drink less, and she wants to smoke less, and she wants to get a boyfriend. And I will give a trigger warning. There's a lot of weight talk in this book. It is from the 90s, so she writes about, she always is noting her weight, and she wants to lose weight, and there's a lot of weight talk. But try not to let that dissuade you from reading it, because it's a really, really funny book. And I didn't realize this, but it is based on Pride and Prejudice, and there's many similarities between the two. The love interest in both is named Darcy. Bridget Jones and Elizabeth Bennet, they both face societal pressure to couple up. They both have embarrassing mothers and reserved fathers. There's a plot point in each where both Bridget and Elizabeth are temporarily charmed by a handsome womanizer in the movie played by Hugh Grant, who tells a deceptive tale of betrayal from Darcy to ruin his reputation, and then it turns out that it was Darcy who was wronged by the womanizer. And fun fact that we noted that Colin Firth plays Darcy in the BBC Pride and Prejudice, and Colin Firth plays Darcy in the movie version of this book, which is a wonderful adaptation of a book as well. So I would highly recommend reading the book and watching the movie. Bridget Jones's Diary by Helen Fielding.
Nice.
Yeah.
I might have to read that one too.
Oh, it's so fun. It's so fun.
Now, my recommendation is going to seem silly, but it's also kind of in the Austen verse, and that's because I went with Pride and Prejudice and Zombies by Seth Graham Smith. We're recording this just before Halloween. The podcast will be available November 1st, so just after Halloween. This book came out from Quirk Press, and apparently they had this idea, there were jokes going around the internet for a long period of time about characters like pirates and ninjas and zombies and such. And then people were kind of mashing them up with titles of classic out of copyright works. And so at one point, the head of the publishing company was like, had Pride and Prejudice and zombies in his head. And so he put this project in the hands of Seth Graham Smith and said, do something with this. And he basically, per my understanding, used the original text and then started modifying the story to include zombies. So if you like Pride and Prejudice, but you think it needs more action sequences, this might be your gig. It follows a similar storyline, except that England is in the midst of a mysterious zombie plague. You have the scenes from Pride and Prejudice, but just periodically they've got to deal with zombies. Elizabeth and her sister Jane use their martial arts skills to protect the attendants of that ball at the beginning from a zombie horde. Later on at Pemberley, like when Elizabeth goes there and instead of coming out of a pond, Mr. Darcy is fighting off a horde of zombies. And, the reason that Jane has to stay at Netherfield because she's ill, it's because she was attacked by a zombie on the way there, and they're worried that she might have the illness. And, and then when, I'm spoiling it a little bit here, but then when Mr. Darcy is convincing Bingley not to marry Jane, it's because he's worried that she might have contracted the disease, and various other things happen. Some characters die off, so other parts of the plot change. And so it's just kind of a fun take on the original story that you might enjoy.
I was curious about this book, too.
Yeah.
And I was reading a bit about it, and it does follow chapter by chapter. Like if you turn to chapter 17 in Pride and Prejudice, and then turn to chapter 17 in Pride and Prejudice and Zombies, it's the exact same moment in the same language with, you say, the unwelcome addition of zombie attacks. And the other thing that was interesting is it finally explains what the militia is doing there. Because you never really, in Pride and Prejudice, like, why are they all just encamped there? It's like, well, because to fight the zombies.
Oh, of course.
Yeah. Although, did it say in the forward to the book, or was it something else I was reading that mentioned that this was taking place during the Napoleonic Wars, and so the militia was around because they were preparing to fight overseas? But it's never mentioned in the book because I guess it's happening right now. She didn't feel a need to explain it to her readers. So now, for everyone's favorite segment, Nerd Words for Word Nerds, where we expose our most beloved words to society's harsh judgment. Who would like to put forward their word first?
Maybe I'll go, because my word has already been mentioned on this episode by Toby in her introduction and biography of Jane Austen. So my word, and I may need help pronouncing it, profligacy?
Yeah, I said profligate, but I don't know.
So profligacy, let's just say, is the fact or the habit. There's sort of two meanings to this word. One is sort of friendlier than the other. The more kind of friendly version is the habit or the fact of using money, time, or materials in a careless way. Or, and I think this is the way that Jane Austen meant it, sheer debauchery or depravity, licentiousness, degeneracy, wantonness, promiscuity, excess, immoderation, impropriety, gluttony, prodigality, disorder, unruliness, unrestrained arrogance, audacity, and sauciness.
Ooh.
So, all words you don't want to see on your performance review. So that is my word, profligacy. If only I knew how to pronounce it.
Mm-hmm.
My word has also been mentioned this episode, and that is the word condescension. So that appears quite often in this book, and I kept thinking I was reading it wrong. Like, I kept thinking, is this the right word or the word I'm thinking of? Because in a contemporary meaning, if someone condescends to you, they're insulting you. But in this novel, people are condescending to each other all the time, and it doesn't seem to be an insult. Like, Mr. Collins describes Lady Catherine as all affability and condescension. So I was a little confused by that. So I looked it up. Merriam-Webster defines condescension as a patronizing attitude or behavior, which is how I know it. But it appears the meaning of the word has evolved over time, and that in the 18th century it denoted a positive characteristic of a person of superior breeding or class lowering themselves to speak kindly to an inferior, which is still insulting. Like, I don't know what's positive about that. I did read an article that Austen may have used the word as an insult, especially considering in this novel that it's most often used in the context of Mr. Collins and Lady Catherine. But I just thought that was interesting. So, condescension.
I thought about that word a lot, too, as the book went on, because, it has more or less the same meaning today. It's just that we have different attitudes about superiority.
Yeah.
Like back then, they thought that these people were better than them, and therefore, if they did condescend to speak to you, you were lucky because you got the attention of the important person. Whereas now, if someone talks in a way that we think is condescending, we're like, you think you're better than me? You're not better than me. You know, our feeling about what that means has changed just because of our difference in social structure. Well, that's a good word. I could consider that for my own nerd word.
Ooh, close call.
But I did not pick that one, and I picked one that we haven't said yet during this podcast, but which appeared in the novel 18 times. And that is, well, I have the ebook version, so I just had a search function.
Oh, okay.
One of the advantages of ebooks. Anyways, the word is felicity. So I'm more familiar with felicity as a name than a noun, and I had to look it up because of how often it showed up. There are two senses of the word. The first is happiness, or things that make one happy, and this is the meaning that was used throughout the novel. They were frequently referring to the character's search for felicity in marriage. Lydia was doing stuff that would work against her felicity, so it came up a lot in that context. The second sense of the word is that it is a pleasing manner or quality, especially in art and language. Like when you say someone has a felicity with words. And that seemed appropriate because many readers enjoy Jane Austen's felicity with words. According to Merriam-Webster, the word in its first sense was used since the 14th century, derives from the Middle English felicite, which ultimately derives from Latin felix, which means fruitful or happy. And when I was looking up that etymology, there was a moment where I thought that felix might also be the root word for feline, which made sense to me because cats make me happy. But it turns out feline is derived from felis, not felix. I still maintain, though, that cats are sources of happiness. And with that, I wish you all great felicity. So unfortunately, that's all the time we have this month. Thank you so much for joining us, dear readers. For our next episode, we're going to read and discuss Small Things Like These by Claire Keegan. It is 1985 in a small Irish town. During the weeks leading up to Christmas, Bill Furlong, a coal merchant and family man, faces into his busiest season. Early one morning, while delivering an order to the local convent, Bill makes a discovery which forces him to confront both his past and the complicit silences of a town controlled by the church. An international bestseller, Small Things Like These, is a deeply affecting story of hope, quiet heroism, and empathy from one of our most critically lauded and iconic writers. Have comments or book suggestions for us? Send us an email. You can find all our contact info at the bottom of the page at wpl-podcast.winnipeg.ca. You can also find all our past episodes there too. If you haven't already, subscribe to Time to Read on your favorite podcasting service, and maybe leave us a review. Tell your book-loving friends about us too. And until next time, make sure you find time to read. Still there, Toby? Toby? We lost Toby. Toby?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Maybe she's run off to place a hold on Han Kang's novels.
Can you hear me?
Oh, you
Toby,
did make a pretty convincing case.
Toby, you can wait till the end of the episode. Really, I mean.
Can you hear me?
Oh, maybe Wi-Fi's not so good in the sunroom.
Yeah.
Am I?
Whoa.
Hello?
Can you hear me and see me?
Now we can't hear you.
Can't hear you.
You can't hear me.
No.
But your lens flare is gone, so that's maybe an improvement.
Yeah, all I know to check is the mic button.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, it looks like you're not muted, so it's not that, but maybe it's...
Can you hear us, Toby?
Oh, she's gone again.
Nope. Maybe rebooting or something.
Yeah. Might need to break the glass on virtual Toby and have her join the chat.
Technical difficulties.
I guess the only hiccup would be if her recording she's still recording, then it should be fairly easy to edit all this part out, right? If
Oh, yeah, totally. If she stopped recording, then we'll have to do a new count in, but
sure.
that's okay.
Yeah.
Hello?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Now we can hear you, yes.
That was really weird. My Teams it just shut. It just closed all of a sudden. And then I tried to rejoin on a browser, and that's when you couldn't hear me. Okay, sorry about that.
Oh, okay.
Let's hope it doesn't happen again.
Yeah. You kept your phone recording the whole time?
Yep.
Okay, so no problems.